Good afternoon. My name is Gaston Alonso. I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College. And I am really both excited and honored to welcome you to today's event, When We Decide, Plural Agency, Voluntariness, and Migrant Choice by Ariana Peruzzi Sancio. This is the second of a three-part series on the philosophy of immigration that we are sponsoring this semester. And there are many of you on here who were here a couple of weeks ago when we had our first event. So thank you for joining us again. I'm going to leave it to Professor Matthew Lindauer, who is the main organizer of the series, to introduce both the series and the event. But for now, let me invite you to join our final event of the series on April 10th at 6 p.m. online. Diminished Citizenship of U.S. Citizen Children of Undocumented Migrants by Lori Gallegos, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Texas State University. We'll be sharing the link on the chat with information for that event. Right. Let me also take this time to thank the sponsors of the series, the Department of Philosophy and the Immigrant Success Office, along with the Departments of Anthropology, English, History, Judaic Studies, Political Science, Puerto Rican and Latinx Studies, and Sociology, and the programs in Caribbean Studies, in Studies in Religion, and Urban Sustainability, the Center for the Study of Brooklyn, and the Haitian Studies Institute at Brooklyn College. There has been lots of support and excitement for the series on campus. I also want to invite you to join us the first week of April for what we call HES Week. That is a series of 8 public events organized to honor the work of this year's HES Scholar in Residence, historian Paul Ortiz from the University of Florida. We have 25 speakers, 8 events, 4 days. We'll be having important discussions about academic freedom, about the crisis of democracy in this country, and about the role of oral history and movement solidarity in defending those. The link for that program will be shared in the chat as well. And lastly, please follow us on social media to learn about upcoming programming from the Wolf Institute, and we'll share those links as well. And with that, let me introduce Professor Matthew Lindauer, who will host today's event. Matthew Lindauer is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Brooklyn College and Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Psychology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He specializes in moral and political philosophy and moral psychology. His research focuses on the role that empirical facts should play in the evaluation of normative concepts. Please help me welcome Professor Lindauer. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Gaston, and to all of you for being here. And to our speaker, Ariana, who I will introduce in a moment. I would also be remiss, I'm told that I should do this if I didn't mention that today is my parents' wedding anniversary, and they've chosen to be here as part of their anniversary to listen to a philosophy talk. So perhaps the apple doesn't fall so far from the tree. Well, it's great to be here. Again, I'm very thankful to everyone who helped put this series together, Professor Campos in Philosophy Department, the Wolf Institute, ESO, the Immigrant Student Success Office on campus, and everyone else who's involved, and I apologize for not mentioning. We're really committed at Brooklyn College to bringing theory and practice together and thinking about the way that philosophy can inform our lives. And we could think of no other kind of promising young scholar whose work speaks to this kind of commitment more than Ariana Peruzzi Sancio, PhD student currently at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Michigan. So her talk is entitled When We Decide, Plural Agency, Voluntariness, and Migrant Choice. She's going to present some of her work to us, and then she and I will have a conversation, a brief one. Soon after, we will open up to questions from all of you. So we look forward to having audience input as well. But without further ado, I'll turn things over to Ariana. And thank you again for presenting to us.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you, Matt, Daniel, Gaston, everyone who has organized. I really appreciate this chance to present my research. I'm going to share screen. Can you see my screen now, or
There
is
we
that?
go. It looks like it's starting
There
up.
we go. Great. All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. This presentation is called When We Decide, Plural Agency, Voluntariness, and Migrant Choice. And the question that I am addressing today is, when is migration voluntary? So when you think of philosophy, you probably think of the question, do we have free will? When is our choice voluntary? When is our action voluntary? I wanted to think about a question that was a little bit closer to my heart. I began to think about whether migration is voluntary after seeing a number of my family members who are attempting to find various ways to leave Venezuela and had many different kinds of routes. And so I started with this question. It matters for two kinds of reasons. First, there's conventional wisdom, there's sort of a consensus among both philosophers, and there's been some polling of the public that shows most people think non-voluntary migrants are more entitled to be admitted, to be protected from deportation, to get a path to citizenship, and to get special protections than migrants who are voluntary. So there's some sort of public belief that non-voluntary migrants should have certain kinds of special entitlements. There's also a growing patchwork of international and domestic legal protections for forced or displaced migrants. So the most obvious one that we know about is the institution of refugeehood and asylum. That is an institution that only protects a small subset of displaced people. So only those who have been persecuted on one of 5 protected grounds are eligible to be considered refugees or asylum seekers. So there are actually various other kinds of subsidiary humanitarian protection that people can get if they've been forced out of their homes or displaced. So if you petition for asylum and you lose your case, you might be given humanitarian parole, which allows you to stay in the country temporarily. There's also something called temporary protected status, which the United States gives to various ethnic groups who are experiencing severe turmoil or disaster in their home countries. This is also temporary, and it's only given to people who have entered the United States before a certain date. Another thing that Biden has recently created are humanitarian entrance visas. So these are visas that are given to only 6 ethnic groups. So Ukrainians, Haitians, El Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, or Cubans. It's actually capped unless you're Ukrainian, and you can get a humanitarian entrance visa that allows you to enter the US and stay temporarily. So these are all legal protections that are meant to help folks who've been forced out of their homes or displaced. And so if we're going to continue to try to protect people in various kinds of ways who have been forced to migrate, who we can't say have migrated voluntarily, then we need a good idea of what it means to have migrated voluntarily. We need to have a sense of how we should draw that distinction. So I think that this is a question that is particularly difficult. I think it's actually very difficult to figure out when migration is voluntary. And I think that precisely because it's such a difficult question, it's also a very philosophically interesting question. So in the process of this presentation, I'm going to suggest that pursuing this question helps us rethink not just how we classify economic migrants, it's also going to help us rethink how we conceive of voluntary action more generally. I think it's going to lead us down some really thorny and interesting paths. By the way, this painting is called Zulia, 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 and it's a painting of migrants crossing between Venezuela and Colombia that I really like. So to start, we have to begin with the received view of when migration is voluntary. So I think the most compelling, the most prominent account of voluntary migration comes to us from 2 Italian philosophers, Valerio Donelli and Tiziana Torresi. These 2 philosophers present a view that hinges on these 4 jointly sufficient and individually necessary criteria. So the idea is that migration is voluntary only if the individual who migrates is 1, not coerced, 2, has enough information to migrate. They're not deceived, they're not manipulated. 3, the individual has to have good enough alternatives at home other than migrating. So they call this the criteria of sufficiency. They have to have sufficient alternatives. And last, the migrant has to have exit options. So the idea here is that once the migrant is abroad, we can still ask whether or not they're there voluntarily. It's going to be important that they have the ability to return home voluntarily in order to call them a voluntary migrant. So the idea is this: you might go to a place voluntarily, and once you're there, say your boss takes away your passport and holds it so you can't return, or you're otherwise coerced, or you're just completely out of money, you have no way to get back. We would say that even if you originally went there voluntarily, you are no longer a voluntary migrant. You need to have exit options to remain a voluntary migrant. So these 4 criteria are meant to capture many of the most clear-cut cases of when migration is not voluntary, such as when people are trafficked or when they're refugees, but also cases like cases of economic migration, where we think that the economic migration was not voluntary because the people who are leaving might have faced very severe consequences of poverty had they stayed. So specifically, I'm going to focus in this presentation on criteria 3, the idea of good enough alternatives, because this is probably the broadest criteria. So Ottonelli and Doresi conceptualize good enough alternatives in terms of an objective and transcontextual minimal standard of well-being. And what that really is meant to say is not that this is a subjective standard of what a good enough life looks like. They are thinking in terms of the migrants' most basic minimal needs. If those most basic minimal needs are met, your needs for shelter, your need for food, your need for human connection, then you have a good enough life. If you cannot meet those needs at home, then your migration journey is not voluntary on this account. So I thought that this account was very promising. I think that one problem with the account is that these 4 criteria, or at least the first 3, apart from exit options, are meant to be drawn directly from the action theory playbook. So the way Ottonelli and Torresi explain this is they say there's too much application of double standards when it comes to talking about voluntariness and migration. And you see that especially when you're watching the news. For example, in the discussion of, say, migrant caravans in 2017, you'll see the Democrats say, oh, everybody in this caravan is a refugee. Nobody's coming voluntarily. And then you'll see the Republicans say sort of the opposite. Everybody here is coming voluntarily. Nobody has been forced to migrate. These are all just people seeking a better life. And Ottonelli and Torresi say quite rightly that the problem with this kind of dialogue is that both sides are using double standards. So sides that are very concerned, like the side that's very concerned, the humanitarian concern for migrants can lead us to set the bar for migration being a voluntary decision very high, to say that almost all choices to migrate are not voluntary, because we want to say these people had no choice, and that therefore we are well justified in providing them with these entitlements. And then on the contrary side, if you are very antagonistic to migrants, if you don't want migrants to come to the United States, you might set the bar for it being a voluntary decision very low. So it looks like everybody came voluntarily. And Ottonelli and Torresi say, we want to just use the same exact criteria that philosophers are using to evaluate more simple acts, like picking up a pencil, to evaluate migration, because that way we're going to cut out all of these double standards. So I think that they're right to be very concerned about double standards. I think all of that sounds great. The problem is that migration is actually a really complicated act, and it's not at all like picking up a pencil. And there are a few ways in which it's complicated. First of all, it's not useful to think of migration as a single act, like a single act of crossing a border that happens in a moment. There's actually a whole series of acts. You have to raise the money. You have to decide how you're going to go. You might take a bus to a train. You might walk. You might take a plane. There's going to be quite a few steps. You're going to have to gather information about your choice for a long time. And you're probably not going to make that decision by yourself. You might not even be the person who came up with it. In fact, it's very likely that the decision is going to be made not by the migrant alone, but by a group. So there's a few ways in which that can happen. So often we see whole families decide that they're migrating together, family migration. But there's other ways in which groups may decide together that they're going to take on a migration project. I'm going to say more about that in a second, but the immediate problem that I saw was the standard account is assuming that the person who decides to migrate is just the person who does migrate. And that's not necessarily true. It's actually very likely that a whole group of people, a household, a family, is the one that is deciding to migrate. And therefore, when we're trying to evaluate whether the decision was voluntary or not, we're going to have to look at the procedure that the group used to decide, and not just at that one individual. So, like I said, I'm going to say a little bit more about the ways in which migration is something that's often undertaken by a group, even when it's not the case that the whole family goes together. So the most clear-cut case is, like I said, whole family goes, but I think that remittance-oriented migration is also a really interesting case where usually it's a household, a group, or a family that's deciding, and not an individual. So what do I mean by remittance-oriented migration? So remittances is just the name for money that migrants send back to their families or loved ones at home in their home country. The interesting thing is that most migration is economic migration. And much of that migration is actually undertaken with the intention of making money to send back home. So migration to remit is a risk reduction mechanism for households. And I find it really fascinating, actually, to think about how effective migration to remit is as an economic strategy. A lot of what makes it effective, if, say, we'll use Venezuela as an example because a lot of my family is Venezuelan. Say if I'm here in the US and my grandma is in Venezuela and we're both working jobs, this is a risk reduction mechanism for us to have jobs in two very different places and two very different economies. Because if the US economy is bad, I can respond to that by asking my grandmother for help. She can send me money. And of course, it's always much more likely to be the other way. If the Venezuelan economy is bad, I send my grandmother money. Because our household has multiple breadwinners across geographical and social and economic space, we are able to sort of diversify our portfolio as a household. So migration to remit is a way of reducing risk, and it's particularly important in developing contexts in places like Latin America, where people cannot rely on social insurance schemes or protection from the government from natural disaster. If disaster strikes or economic upheaval strikes, these are not risks that people are prepared to handle or can rely on their government for help with. They need to send someone abroad in order to send that money back in case disaster strikes. So migration to remit is very, very common and extremely important. And it's also something that's usually a household strategy. So economists writing about migration to remit describe informal contracts with households. The way I understand that is that households often come together and say, things are just not working out. The household isn't solvent. A breadwinner is going to have to go abroad and decide amongst themselves, whether they want to send, say, a child who's reaching adulthood or sometimes a parent. Often it's a decision that the household makes together. So I just wanted to say a little bit more about how important remittances are. In the last couple of years, I think actually remittances hit almost 800 billion last year. And there's actually almost 1 billion people involved in one way or another with remittance migration. About 800 million people receive remittances in the developing world, and there's about 200 million migrants who are sending money home. And you can see that remittances actually really outstrip the amount of money that's provided in official development aid to countries. So this blue line here, ODA, that's official development aid that's sent. FDI, that is foreign direct investment. The blue line, yeah, debt and equity flows. So you can compare, you can see this dark blue line, there's a lot less money being given in official aid when you compare it to the money that migrants just send back to their own families. Another way in which remittances can be very important is, like I said before, they're counter-cyclical. That means that the worse the economy is back in the home country, the more migrants will sacrifice and save and send home remittances to counter those disasters. So they're really crucial to a lot of people. There's a great number of people engaged in this kind of migration. And it's a household. It's primarily a household endeavor. So I want to give a personal example now, so we can have a sort of a test case of someone who was part of a household that decided to engage in a migration project together. So this is, I've made up a fake name, but this is pretty much based on my my mom's cousin, who I saw migrate between Venezuela and Chicago over the last number of years. So Sara lives in Tinaco, Venezuela with her parents and her teen son. In 2017, she loses her job and her father's diagnosed with heart disease. The family struggles to find the money for his heart medication. They decide together that Sara will move to Chicago to work and remit. So I'm going to add a little bit more detail to the story. I think one of the things that was really interesting to me in seeing my cousin's journey was that she came to the US and back multiple times. So initially she had a tourist visa. She would come to the US, she would work for 90 days on this tourist visa. She would have multiple jobs. She would save as much money as she could, and she would send it back, and she would go home afterwards because she was helping take care of her parents. She didn't want to leave her son. And every time she would come to the US, she would say, I think if I apply for asylum or if I apply for, their temporary protected status, there are various things open to Venezuelans, I could stay, but at the same time, I don't really want to leave my son. And then in 2017, this very sort of difficult moment happens where her father is diagnosed with heart disease and the medication was not available easily in Venezuela. And it was also very difficult to put together the money. At that moment, she decided, I have to go back to the US, and this time I have to stay. If I don't do this, I know that my family is no longer going to be able to pay for his medication. And when she was making that decision, it wasn't a decision that she made by herself. I think it's actually more accurate to say it wasn't her decision alone. It was the decision that the household made and that the household talked over amongst themselves a number of times. It was something that they decided together after a lot of reflection. So the question that I asked was, is this a voluntary journey? Well, I think it depends on whether we think that the person who decided to migrate was my cousin, Sara, an individual, or whether we think that the agent that decides was actually a group, the family or the household in this case. This is just a picture of Tinaco that I thought I'd share. So it was obviously my intuition that this was a group decision. And I think that if we're going to understand it as a group decision, philosophy gives us the tools to really clarify how we ought to think about it as a group decision. What are the sort of consequences of thinking of it that way? And what does it mean for it to be a group decision in this really robust sense? And so here I turn to the language of plural agency. So plural agency is a way of describing various kinds of robust group action. And plural agency is specifically Gilbert's language for describing like collective action. So my favorite account is Margaret Gilbert's account. She has this sort of two-part account where the central concept or the central idea is that of a joint commitment that a group makes. So on this view, a joint commitment is a commitment made when first each member of a group expresses willingness to do their part to ensure that the group acts as a body. Secondly, each member has to express this willingness under conditions of common knowledge of every other member's expression of willingness. So she says if these two conditions are met, then we should understand the group as having jointly committed themselves, so that the act that they are undertaking is not an act that we should say individuals are undertaking, but it's a group action. So I think that this is a particularly helpful concept because I think this is exactly what was going on in the case of my cousin's migration. I think that she, together with her parents, met a number of times, thought things through, decided together that they were each going to do their part to engage in this migration project. And I think that each of them made this agreement under conditions of understanding that every other member was also similarly agreeing to go through with this. Now, one thing that I think I'm going to raise just from the beginning that's a little bit interesting about this account that I'm trying to motivate here is I'm thinking of the joint commitment to migrate, or the project of migration that they're engaged in, as something that even people who are not leaving home are involved in. So I'm thinking the whole household is engaged in this project together. They've made the decision together, and they're all playing their own particular kind of role. I think that this representation of what's going on in this kind of migration project is actually consistent with recent literature in anthropology about migration, and especially the work of non-mobile household members, the people who stay at home. So there's been some recent literature that says, hey, this work that non-mobile members do is often erased, it's feminized work, but it's actually just as important to this project as the person who moves and gets the job. So the people who are stay at home still participate in a variety of ways. So in my cousin's case, her parents helped her raise the funds that she was going to need to be able to get the visa, to be able to buy the plane ticket. They helped her gather information about how to get the visa, about where to go, nature. And the people who were left behind, they also had to take on new kinds of care labor. So her parents were helping take care of her son was helping take care of her parents. And then there's also the mutual caring and affection and the emotional labor that people do across space on the phone with each other even. I think that's important as well. And so the way that I'm thinking about this migration project is one that is truly undertaken by a group. They decide together and they engage in the project together, even when it is the case that some members stay at home. And I think this is actually completely consistent with the way that Margaret Gilbert talks about other kinds of group actions. She gives the example of, she talks about Ted and Carol who have a baby together. And she says, even when Carol's at the movies, we can, if she makes an agreement with Ted that he's going to feed the baby while she's gone at the movies, there's still a sense in which it's the both of them together that are taking care of their baby. I think this is exactly the same thing that's going on in this migration project. The group together is undertaking it. And that's going to be really important to thinking about whether we should decide, we should describe these acts as voluntary or not. So I part of this project, I think, is really thinking through the ways in which migration is a very thorny kind of act and complicates our understanding of action. So I want to flag another way in which migration sort of complicates how we think about joint commitments. So Margaret Gilbert says that after a joint commitment is formed, each member of the plural agent is going to perform various subroutines required to do their part to actually fulfill the goal that's been agreed to. So what happens when doing your part is complicated? So migration, one of the things that's different about migration as a project than about the feeding the baby example I just gave is, again, there are many parts. It also takes a very long time. And there's going to be a great deal of individual initiative that everyone's going to have to have a lot of initiative to actually fulfill all of their parts. And so how should we think about this kind of a sort of complicated situation where we have a family or a household that has a lot of ongoing projects with each other, and they take on migration as yet another project? So one distinction I've introduced to help try to think about this is to say, well, maybe we can think about joint commitments, some of them as there being sort of different kinds. So some joint commitments are overarching commitments, and some of them are sort of subsidiary commitments that fall out of those overarching commitments. So I think it's often the case that households or families are going to make these really big commitments to each other. Like we might have commitments to mutually care for each other, to take care of each other, to provide funds to the household, to maybe do our part of the labor in the home. We might have this really big commitment, standing commitment to each other, that we're going to do our part to mutually protect and care for each other. And then out of that goal, if we're really trying to fulfill that goal, there might be further commitments that we have to perform in order for the first one to actually be fulfilled. So I think that this is often the case of what's going on with the decision to migrate. So in the case of my cousin, Sada, her family already had a standing commitment. They all lived together in one sort of colonial house. They had an agreement about who was going to be paying for what and who was going to contribute funds to the household. And in order to sort of fulfill those standing commitments to each other, they realized that they were going to have to make sort of further commitments. They were going to have to take on a migration project in order for it to be possible for the house to stay solvent. So this is the distinction I'm suggesting. We can say that if a joint commitment to act plays a structuring role for a group over a long period of time, we should call it an overarching joint commitment. If a joint commitment is formed by a group in order to fulfill a standing joint commitment that they've already committed to, let's call it a subsidiary joint commitment. And I think that the commitment to migrate is subsidiary to the commitment to mutually support in most cases. I think usually it's a case where a household or families like already decided together, hey, we're going to make sure that we stay together, we stay in the same house, and that we can all eat, we all have shelter, we take care of each other, and migration turns out to be the only way to actually fulfill that goal. So having said all this, I think that this turns out to be sort of really important for how we evaluate whether or not a given migration journey is actually voluntary. So as I said from the beginning, one problem with the standard view is it assumes that the person who's deciding to migrate is an individual. It doesn't really have the flexibility yet to talk about what happens when a group is deciding to migrate. So in the full-length paper version of this, I talk about all 4 of these criteria and how they can be revised to be apt to groups. I think that the criteria themselves are actually on the right track, but I think it's possible to think about how we would apply each of them to groups. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on criteria 3, the criteria of good enough alternatives. And if you remember the idea that in order to migrate voluntarily, you have to have good enough alternatives at home. You have to be able to meet your basic needs at home. So if we're going to talk about what it means for a group to fulfill this criteria, I think that we should take a summative approach. So the summative view is that every member of the plural agent has to have good enough alternatives in order for the agent as a whole to have good enough alternatives. It's the summative view because we're just summing up the the state of the individuals in order to determine whether the whole has a good enough state of well-being to be considered making a voluntary choice. So what does this mean in context? So let's think about my example case again, Sada's journey. So Sada's father was one of the people who was deciding as part of this household that Sada was going to choose to migrate. And again, in this case, her decision to migrate, and she decided to go again on a temporary visa, and then she decided to stay permanently. She applied for temporary protected status and got it, and later applied successfully for asylum. This decision was a decision that he made as part of this household. And it was a decision where he knew that if she did not go, he was very likely to die, and probably quite soon. He did not have an adequate alternative to choosing a migration project. And I would think that if he did not, I would say that the agent as a whole did not. And I think part of what's really interesting about this case is that, if we were thinking about it from the perspective of singular agency, if we were just thinking about Sara herself, does she have a, is this a real choice for her? Does she have a good enough alternative if she stays at home, if we're only considering her outcomes? On the standard view of voluntariness and migration, it looks like she does. Ottonelli and Torresi actually say, sometimes migrants choose to migrate for the sake of their family members. That doesn't mean that their decision was not a voluntary one. It just means that they are self-sacrificing. So I think on the standard view, if you look at it from the perspective of singular agency, it just looks like she's just a very self-sacrificing person, but she made a voluntary choice. Her life would have been okay even if her father had passed away. She's not the idea is like you can have a good enough life even if you don't have your parents with you forever. I think that this isn't the right. I think this is just not the right lens, though, to view that decision. Like I've said before, I don't think it's appropriate to use the perspective of singular agency to evaluate this choice, because it was a decision that she only had a part in. I think it was a decision that was made by a household. And so in order to appropriately recognize this migration project, we have to see it as a group action, and again, to apply a very different kind of evaluative criteria, one that looks at the well-being of each member of the group in order to determine whether the specific act of migration was voluntary. So some conclusions now and a few notes on further research. So I think the most obvious conclusion from this, I think it's clear just from the example that we looked at that it's potentially many economic migrants have been misclassified as voluntary. So I think these are people like Sara who probably had sufficient alternatives at home. They would have been able to meet a standard of well-being at home as individuals, but whose households did not have sufficient alternatives. So cases where it's a group that's decided, and we've only looked at whether the individual who migrated had alternatives at home, when really we should have looked at the group in order to determine whether the choice was actually voluntary or not. I want to say a little bit more about why I think this wasn't just a weird thing that happened to my cousin, but something that many migrants might, a situation that many migrants might have been in. So the thing to remember, first of all, is that there's a huge wage differential between the wages that you might make in a developing context and in, say, the United States or other places in which people are likely to migrate to remit. So if you're migrating, say, between Mexico and the US, you're likely to be able to increase your wages by 10 times. The other thing to keep in mind is that most remittance-oriented migrants are breadwinners for their family. They're also most likely to be the most educated and most able-bodied members of the family. And there's often somewhat of a selection effect as well, where people who would be more likely to do well, both at home and abroad, are the ones who the family says, like, hey, you should be the one to go. You're the most likely to actually succeed. All of this matters because it suggests, like, these are actually people who probably would meet the criteria for sufficient alternatives if we were just evaluating their individual lives. Like, it's like, yeah, I look at Sara and I say, like, you're very educated. You did quite well for yourself as an individual. You probably could have taken care of yourself sufficiently well at home in Venezuela. The problem is that you aren't responsible only for yourself. You are part of a group that you have committed yourself to, and that has committed itself to you. And that group as a whole, you have 3 dependents. That group as a whole could not, you could not support on the wages that you were receiving at home. And so again, it's this problem of using an individual lens when what actually we need to see is a group. So I think that there's actually quite a number of people who are potentially in my cousin's position. Like I said, there's 200 million people who remit. Many of them are likely to be able to do well for themselves at home, but not for the groups that they are part of. So I think that it's going to be really important to use the perspective of plural agency to try to properly recognize these kinds of migration projects. The last thing I'd like to talk about is, sort of further research and just some notes on methodology. So some further directions for research. I think that this, in this presentation, I've tried to clarify what it means for migration to be voluntary. I haven't taken a stand on whether the concept of voluntariness should play such a role in determining who is admitted or who gets what protections. I think that's a further question. And actually, in recognizing the ways in which voluntariness is super complicated, we might also begin to wonder whether it might not be something that we want our migration system to make decisions based on, especially because the system is very underfunded, and this might be something that's actually quite hard to determine. So it might actually be better to have a system that considers the consequences of deporting migrants instead of trying to determine, are they voluntary or are they not voluntary? Did they make the choice voluntarily or not? If we're going to get into sort of very fine-grained philosophical problems. I think a further area for research is, I think I'd like to see more research on group agency when it comes to thinking about migration. So when you talk to anthropologists of migration, they talk about migration practices. They're always thinking in terms of communities that practice migration, collectives that are migrating. They're not thinking in such individualist terms as we are in philosophy. And I think that we also need to think about the ways in which groups are engaging in migration. For example, one thing I'm thinking about now is how community norms might affect the decisions of household to migrate. Last, just a final note on the methodology of this paper. One of the things I've been trying to do in this paper is to drive home the idea that philosophers of migration really actually need to pay more attention to the very serious work of conceptualizing the act of migration itself, because migration is very complicated. There are some restrictivists like Kit Wellman or David Miller who talk about migrants as troublesome neighbors, or we'll use that metaphor, neighbors who just appear on your doorstep. And these kinds of metaphors or these kinds of ways of talking make it seem like migrants just wake up one day, do sort of a cost-benefit analysis of whether they should move or not, and then just move themselves from A to B in one snap of a finger. And that is, of course, not how migration works. And I think that having impoverished conceptions of migration as a practice and as a process sort of lead us to make normative mistakes down the line when we're thinking about what entitlements migrants should have. So I would really hope that folks get interested in thinking more about practices of migration itself and how that might be relevant to us as philosophers. All right, thank you so much again to the organizers and to all of you for attending today. I really appreciated getting to share this with you all.
Let's just applaud our speaker for this wonderful talk. So original and also so tied to the empirical realities that actual migrants face. And it's interesting. I first wanted to just, I don't want to take up too much time with my questions because there are people in the audience who will have many questions. But one thing I wanted to just ask you about is how, you've talked a lot in a kind of very candid and open way about how maybe certain facts about people in your family or your life have shaped your view on this. It seems like for a long time, work on the philosophy of migration and some of the theorists that you mentioned kind of really stuck in a kind of very individualistic frame, not considering the fact that for many people, their family members are just as important as themselves in deciding how to live, and that you can't really think about your own life without thinking about other people. So one thing that I wanted to ask is just, so even if your account might problematize some policy questions, I thought one really nice benefit is like it provides a really nice ethical kind of argument for maybe talking to people who are not so receptive to migrants about the choices that these other people are making. Like if you could make the argument to someone like, look, maybe this particular individual is not so badly off, but their family members are going to die if they don't come, or are in a really bad shape. And wouldn't you, in such a situation, choose to move? So I wondered if you thought there could be this kind of internal argument that you could give to people who are maybe not being very compassionate to migrants that would like fall out of your nicely developed view.
I think so. I think there's also sort of two ways to think about it. One of them is that I'm sort of pursuing this idea that sometimes, it's the migrant themselves. It just isn't the person who decided. They were one of a group. And so one thing to say is like, well, that's not even really the person who decided. They decided alongside these other folks. But I think there's another argument that you can give, which is like, sometimes the migrant does decide. Sometimes they just are self-sacrificing. Sometimes I want to say like, it is actually appropriate to use the perspective of singular agency. But even if we say it is a voluntary choice and just a self-sacrificing one, what would you have done in that situation? And I think that this is actually something kind of interesting, but I think it was like Jeb Bush once who said like, migrants aren't bad people. Those migrants are there, it was like somebody, the last person you expected, but he said something along the lines of like, these are folks who care about their mothers and their fathers. And I think that's exactly right. It's strange that we're in a place where there's so much demonization of migration that folks can no longer see that.
Yeah, and then a second question that might help to kind of guide the discussion. Thank you so much for that. It's just, and you raised it, you kind of really anticipated a lot of things that people would come up with, and I'm sure that the paper itself goes into all this in a lot of detail. I think a lot of us would be eager to read, more of your work. But yeah, thinking about putting this into policy. So suppose that we did kind of allow this account not to blow up the voluntariness kind of way of thinking in policy. Is it possible that this could be implemented? So we would be able to maybe verify that a person has, it's kind of difficult because everyone has elderly family members who will eventually die and could be helped by more money for healthcare and things like that. So do you think that there is a way to implement in policy? So maybe it's like, especially like for people who have sick children, that might be something that's easy to document and it's not just like a function of getting older. Or do you really think that it would just be very hard for an able-bodied person who themselves is not badly off to make this case that like, well, we as a household decided that like I have to move to like help people back home, and that could be something that a liberal democratic state could verify and so on? Or do you think that it really does show that there's something wrong with this like whole way of thinking about immigration choice?
I don't think it shows there's something wrong with this way of thinking. I think that it's actually really interesting to think about how voluntariness might be normatively relevant to thinking about admissions. I mean, one obvious thought is that if people aren't leaving voluntarily, then it might actually be really silly to try to hold them accountable for their decision to migrate by deporting them, because they were going to leave regardless. It's sort of from a policy perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You might be able to incentivize these migrants to go elsewhere. Like it could have maybe forced my cousin to go to Chile, but you can't force her not to leave if she's not leaving voluntarily. So I do think that it's useful to think more about the connection between voluntariness and things like admissions. I just worry because although it's certainly possible to make that case and document these things, we have such a bad case of when it comes to the asylum system, it's like backed up like 6 years, and this is a case where people have to document things like this, and I'm worried about introducing more institutions where people have to really seriously document their background circumstances, when it could hopefully be a quicker case to say what's going to actually happen to this person and their family if they return, instead of trying to explore the conditions at the time that they left, or etc. Or last thing, temporary protected status is also more effective when there's just clearly a case of turmoil or natural disaster, because it gives everybody from that place the temporary right to stay. And I think that can often be more effective, just blanket, you're able to continue to stay legally here, because we recognize that the situation is so bad there that almost no one is leaving voluntarily, and it wouldn't be useful to try to pick out who is coming in voluntarily and who is not.
Thanks, that's so helpful. I have many other questions, but I think it's right to turn things over to some audience members. I see another immigration scholar, Sergio Gallegos Ordorica. Would you like to ask your question now?
Can you hear me, Matthew?
Yes. Hi. Good to see you again.
Okay. Hi, Ariana. Great to see you. Great talk. Really liked it. I very much enjoyed the account that you basically provided of thinking about decisions to migrate in terms of plural agency, and using particularly Margaret Gilbert's views as a lens to look at decisions undertaken by plural agents regarding how to migrate. So my question is, how far can you actually push that, in the sense that oftentimes individuals are not just part of one group, but multiple ones. Oftentimes people get married, subsequently get divorced, become part basically of a new blended family if they remarry, or if they get together with another partner. And as a result of this, sometimes people basically belong to not just one group, but different ones. And in light of this, my question is the following. To what extent is the belonging of an individual to different plural agents, to what extent is that something that reinforces, in some cases, the drives or the motivations to ultimately migrate? And do you think that, this is actually a follow-up, do you basically see these obligations as a kind of, scalar, as a kind of scalar, as being structured in a kind of scalar dimension, in the sense that they could be added to each other to ultimately justify basically more the need for certain people to migrate, insofar as they belong to different plural agents?
This is a really interesting question. I think it's actually my intuition that if say you have one family and then you divorce and you have another family, we might have to determine whether you belong to multiple sort of plural agents or migration projects by actually going in and saying, like, okay, has a joint commitment been made, and who's party to that joint commitment? Because on Gilbert's account, a plural agent isn't something that sort of just exists simpliciter. It only exists relative to an act or a belief or an intention. And so we could talk about a family as a plural agent if the family is actually committed to some kind of acting or doing together. So maybe if, a family's committed to caring for each other mutually, we say that's a plural agent. So the interesting case of like the person who's divorced is that you kind of have to know a little bit more about their relationship to their like, say, their ex, or what's going on there exactly, to say whether or not there's kind of a group commitment there. And that's relevant to migration, because if you're choosing to migrate, if you're part of a group that's choosing to migrate, you can actually look and say, like, who was part of that decision, who reflected on it, who gathered information, who put forward their views, and then who came to the agreement. And you can say those are the people who are part of the plural agent in respect to the migration project. So that can kind of help us figure out, like, what are actually the specific obligations that are motivating that person there. I mean, that person might have other obligations. It's just, it might be that the earlier family isn't actually part of the plural agent. Is that helpful? Does that get to the? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Daniel Campos is the next.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, my computer's camera doesn't work, but I am here. Thank you, Ariana, for your presentation. One thing I want to highlight, just as a philosopher, because we have so many students in our audience, is that I really appreciate about your talk that it's obviously a very theoretically sophisticated, well thought out position, but it has a very human concern. And it seems also to have this human concern comes from also from the proximity of experiences in your family and so on. And that it's just nice to see that when a philosopher has such a in-depth theoretical engagement with a topic, but there's a human concern at the core of it, and you can see it. You don't. Sometimes philosophers hide that. You don't know where their concerns are coming from, but they're often coming from something they deeply care about. So I appreciated that about your talk and the case that is in some ways related to your cousins and your family. So thank you for that. I am wondering about plural agency in migration in a different kind of scenario, and how your model would analyze it. I mean, a more common case for the US public to think about plural agency in migration is when a whole family, or at least several members of a family unit, immigrate to the US, but some of them are minors. And then after they come as undocumented immigrants, they grow up in the US. For all practical and personal purposes, somewhere in the US becomes their home. But when they grow into adulthood and they can understand better, they have autonomy to think about their options and what has happened with their lives and what they want to do. They don't really have exit options from the US, right? So they grew up here, and it's unreasonable, I think, and also insensible to expect that they could just decide to go back to where their family came from. So that seems to be a reason why some people have sympathy, for example, for the dreamers, right? For young people who benefit from the DACA program. But I am wondering if you think your model applies to that kind of situation, or how it applies, because it's a different scenario. Here's one where many people in the family or in the household moved, but some of them were not really capable of making a decision. So anyway, it's kind of open-ended, but I think your model has an interest, would have interesting things to say about that case. I just wonder if you have thought about such cases, and maybe they're part of your paper and they're just different scenarios. So yeah, that's my question.
Thanks so much. I think the case of people who have been in the US a very long time, but who've been undocumented, even when they're not children, seems like a case where often people aren't voluntary migrants because they don't have exit options. If you've been here 30 years, even if you came as an adult, it's very, very difficult for you to go back and be able to find a job and even fit back. It might actually be very important that you be able to fit in again into your old community. And you may no longer, for example, you may no longer sound like you even speak the same dialect as the people in your community. You may no longer be able to get a job in the industries that are or instead refugee if you're forced back. And that could be true even if you're not a child. I think most extreme for children because sometimes they don't even know the language anymore. So I think these are cases where it's clear that even if you were a voluntary migrant to begin with, you can't be understood as not voluntarily here anymore because you really don't have an option to go back. So I think that's something that this evaluative framework could say about people in that situation. There's a lot to be said, but I want to say one more thing to you, which is just about the first thing you said about there being a a human face. It's just, I do hope people see that one methodology for doing philosophy is to start with a gut feeling that maybe something in the descriptive realm isn't right, because I think a lot of my projects start with reading some philosophy of migration and saying, hey, wait a second, the way that they're talking about this just doesn't seem to match my understanding of actually seeing my family members migrate, you know, or like even just reading this and saying, they're only talking about individuals and they don't talk about the fact that it's like groups or sometimes whole towns that migrate. And so I think this is a way that you can do philosophy is you start with there's something descriptively wrong. And then if we correct that descriptive problem, what are the normative consequences? And what do we learn from that? So thank you so much for that. I really, really enjoyed your question too.
Do any other audience members want to ask a question? Great. Laura Pamplona, please.
Okay, there you go. I
There we
was like,
go.
where's the chat? Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. First of all, thank you for your work and for sharing it with us. I think it's very important work, and I love these spaces because I never thought about a philosophy of migration, and I was like, oh wait, that's a thing. I'm a student at Brooklyn College, and I am also a teacher at the DOE. And as an educator, like I'm always wondering about the intersection between migration and education. And I think my question just follows up Carlos's question because I was like, oh my God, this is it. Like that happened to me. And thinking about like how do teenagers fit in this choice or like decision made by a group? Like how could you use the knowledge to explain to them this big idea of like how we work in a collective effort, or like I know for me, I never had a choice. My mom just came and we just came with her. But how does the knowledge that you provided with us, or how do you envision these knowledge that you gain in this research and doing this work to ease their migrant experience or provide like a little bit more of an understanding of how things happen? I think in just hearing your research out, it kind of opened up for me a way to understand why I'm here basically. And I think that happens a lot with teens that are just like, this just happened to me, like life happened to me. But I think that providing this scope or, you know, this knowledge, like how do you envision your knowledge being seen by teens?
So much. I actually think about this a lot because my cousin had a teenager when she left. I think he was 16 or 17, and she talked to him about it. I actually think he was part of this group that was deciding because she actually was saying to him, Tony, like, I need to know that you're going to be okay. Do you think this is the right thing to do? What do you think? You're going to be taking part in this decision too, because you're also going to have to help take care of your grandparents. And he also had, I think, a fair amount of power to make up his own mind. But I think that's often not the case for teenagers. I might just be giving my cousin a lot of credit because I really like her. Maybe, I don't know. I'm assuming that as a parent, she actually gave him the space to make up his mind. But I think parents often just tell their teenagers, this is what we're doing and this is the plan. And so the interesting thing about your teenage years is you're not quite an adult, but sometimes you do take on adult responsibility. And so I think it might actually be contextual whether or not you are part of the group agent or if you're somebody who has no say at all. And I'll say one last thing. Right now, my partner and I took in his 19-year-old nephew. He lives with us now, and he migrated from Pakistan to live with us. And I was like, does he even want to come here? Because I was writing this paper when this was happening. And my partner was like, I don't know, let's call his mom and ask, does he even want to come here? And I was like, why are we calling his mom? And why shouldn't we ask him? So we asked him, and he was like, my mom wants me to. So I think that was the case for, even though he was 19, it might have been unreasonable to think he was making a lot of the choice because he seemed to not be able to imagine anything other than his parents' decision being the right one for him, even at that age. So I want to say for teenagers, I think it's a little bit depends on your relationship to your family. And people also often ask me about wives under patriarchy. And I think that's also going to turn out to be a tricky subject as well, and not just minors, but other people who are in situations where there's inequality in the home. So I think it's going to depend whether you have a say or not, and it's not just about what age you are. Does that help? Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
Yes. This was really helpful, and I appreciate you allowing a space for a teenager to voice their choices.
Yeah, thanks.
We have time for at least one more question. Anatoly Nikoloda, please. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Feel free to correct me.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I just have a question. Just sort of follows up your discussion of teenagers and somebody coming from Pakistan. Is there like a geography, that it's more like where does your model apply geographically? Are there exceptions? For example, it doesn't apply in India, but it does apply in Pakistan or China or something along these lines.
There's a great deal of remittance migration from South Asia, and it's a lot of that migration is going to the Gulf. And I think that this model could definitely apply there. What I'm particularly interested in is sort of the sweet spot of migrants who are leaving developing contexts, often middle income countries, who are in a situation where they might be somewhat educated and able-bodied. They might be able to take care of themselves, but the wages are not high enough, the opportunities are not good enough that they could take care of their whole family. That situation of like just above poverty is, I think, where you see the situation where people, when you look at them as individuals, they look like they're going voluntarily. But when you look at the group, you realize, no, this is a choice they made together, and this is a choice that they did not make voluntarily. Does that help?
Excellent. I think we should stop there. We've asked some questions and we should do some more reading of Ariana's work. Would you be willing to answer any questions by email if there are others?
I would love to answer questions by email. And if people have questions about doing a PhD or philosophy, I'd be happy to answer those too. Thank you.
Wonderful. Let's all thank our speaker. Thank you so much again for making time for us. It's been really a pleasure and a privilege. Gaston, do you want to wind down the event?
Yes. I mean, I really want to echo Danielle's comments about, the power of using the personal to elucidate the kind of the philosophical, right? The old feminist slogan of the personal is political. You're kind of doing the personal is philosophical in a way, and sort of, the power of kind of using these traditional philosophical questions about free will, right? And then grounding them in the lives of the most marginalized, most vilified people in our society. That's really important, necessary, and I think transformative work. And also the kind of the challenging of the kind of individualism that's undermined, that's kind of hides the social ties in which so many of us are embedded, right? Hopefully, right? So, incredible work, really powerful and transformative, I think, for the conversation. I think at the end of the last event in the series, I talked about how, as a political scientist, I'm learning that when we want to make the world more just and kind, we should listen to the philosophers, right? And so I want to thank you, Ariana, for letting us sort of listen to your voice and learn from your voice. And I want to thank Matthew again for organizing this series to allow us to sort of learn from the philosophers. So thank you so much. And then I want to invite all of those on the call on April 10th at 6 p.m. online. Lori Gallegos from Texas State University, who's on the call, will be closing out the series. The event is the diminished citizenship of U.S. citizen children of undocumented migrants. So I hope to see you all back here on April 10th. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks again.